Hey everyone, Pastor Daniel here. Just wanted to let you know how good my life is. So we live in a manse, which is right next door to the church, which is that way. And as I look out my office window every day, sometimes I see on our side porch, again, it's not even like 30 feet away, I see my wife and our two boys doing homeschooling. I can see them, I can sometimes hear them, and that's just really, really cool. I'm so glad I get to live, work, and worship kind of all in the same place. Although I work lots of different places. Went to the hospital yesterday to visit someone, but still, we're just very blessed. So I'm just thankful for my church body for loving us well and making sure we have our daily bread, and even more so than our daily bread. I want to talk today about a particular concept I picked up from this book given to me a year ago by a pastor in my presbytery, Steve Froelich. He gave it to me my installation service here at Church of the Redeemer. It's a book by Eugene Peterson called as Kingfishers Catch Fire, and that title comes from a poem that Eugene talks about in the opening preface by Gerard Manley Hopkins. And the poem, I think, let's see, look at the poem here. Yeah, it comes in the first line of that poem, which I'll talk about in a second. This is a really good book. I've actually not read through it all the way. Sorry, Steve. It's a collection of basically some sermons, some homilies from Eugene Peterson, and he goes through all different genres of the Bible. So he starts off in the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, and goes through the Psalms and the prophets and wisdom literature and the Gospels and Paul's epistles and then Johannine literature. So I feel like it's not something to be read kind of all in one. Some books you should read all in one sitting. This is a book that you kind of read over time, and especially as I preach on a text, I'll read the chapter of the sermon that Eugene Peterson preaches on that text. This is my own meditation. It's been a good devotional for me this past year. But I want to share with you something which I think is probably the best part of the book, is actually the preface. It's funny, you usually don't think the preface is the best part of the book, but this one is. Eugene Peterson looks at this notion, congruence. Congruence is a notion where it looks at the harmony, especially harmony between ends and means, or inner life, outer life. Is kind of what Eugene Peterson is talking about, and he begins his discussion of congruence with a story where he's listening to a French lecturer named, I never took French, I may butcher the pronunciation, but Paul Tournier, Tournier. So this French lecturer, he's lecturing only in French, and so there's a translator. And after Dr. Tournier's done, the woman next to Eugene Peterson says, "Hey, wasn't that translator great?" And Eugene Peterson responds, "What translator? There wasn't any translator." And to which she said, "Eugene, he was lecturing in French. You don't know 20 words of French. Of course there was a translator." And the whole point is he didn't notice the whole language issue, and there's a translator there because the man himself, Paul Tournier, he just during the lecture, Eugene Peterson said he had a growing feeling that who he was and what he was saying were completely congruent. Just that the way this man lived and what now he was saying here in Baltimore, where they were at, came across as accurate and a mature expression of all that this man had been living and writing. And so he says it was a memorable experience, the transparency of the man, no dissonance between word and spirit, no pretense, and the corresponding transparency of the woman, no ego, no self-consciousness in either one of them. And then he quotes T.S. Eliot's comments on Charles Williams. Here's the quote: "Some men are less than no works, some are more. But Charles Williams cannot be placed in either class. To have known the man would have been enough. To know his books is enough. He was the same man in his life and in his writings." And so he talks about this is the life of congruence. This is the word that Eugene Peterson came up with to best describe this concept, his experience of this man lecturing in French, and Eliot's comments on Charles Williams. And then he gives this poem by Gerard Manley Hopkins, which gives the title for this book, the Kingfishers Catch Fire, as Kingfishers Catch Fire. And so here's the poem. It's just 3 stanzas, pretty short. As kingfishers catch fire, dragonflies draw flame. As tumble over rim and roundy wells, stones ring, like each tucked strings tells, each hung bells. Bow swung finds tongue to fling out broad its name. Each mortal thing does one thing in the same. Deals out that being indoors each one dwells. Selves goes itself. Myself it speaks and spells, crying, what I do is me, for that I came. I say more, the just man justices, keeps grace that keeps all his goings graces, acts in God's eye what in God's eye he is. Christ, for Christ plays in 10,000 places, lovely in limbs and lovely in eyes not his, to the Father through the features of men's faces. And then this is kind of the big section that Peterson gives us. The Christian life is the lifelong practice of attending to the details of congruence. Congruence between ends and means. Congruence between what we do and why we do it. Congruence between what is written in Scripture and our living out what is written. Congruence between a ship and its prow. Congruence between preaching and living. Between a sermon and what is lived in both preacher and congregation. The congruence of the Word made flesh in Jesus with what is lived in our flesh. It is what we admire in an athlete whose body is accurately and gracefully responsive and totally submissive to the conditions of the event. Michael Jordan at one with the court, the game, the basketball, and his fellow players. Or a musical performance in which Mozart, a Stradivarius, and Isaac Perlman fuse and are indistinguishable from one another in the music. Congruence also occurs often enough in more modest venues. A child unself-consciously play, a conversation in which words become as movements in a ballet, revealing all manner of beauty and truth and goodness. A meal bringing friends into a quiet awareness of affection and celebration in a mingling of senses and spirits that provides something like a Eucharistic dimension to the evening. I know some of those are big words. I fumbled over a few of them, but I think you get the basic point. It's what Jesus talks about, I believe in Mark 7, where he says it's not the outer part of the man that makes him unclean. It's from the heart is what comes uncleanness. But from the heart comes our sins. The Bible has this theology of the heart, where the heart is what directs man. Our will, thoughts, emotions, actions all flow from the heart. And so the notion of congruence is a biblical teaching. The harmony between inner life, outer life, and really how the outer life flows from the inner life, essentially, is what Peterson's talking about. And this is just really convicting, because I just thought, okay, what Paul Tourniers do I know? Who do I know? What believers, what Christians have I come across where there seems to be this congruence, and it's beautiful. It's seamless. They're not putting on a show. I can say that they were humble people, Christ-like people, and it was just obvious even from observing them and just talking to them for 5 minutes. Nonetheless, getting to know them over a lifetime, and I came up with maybe 5 or 6 people. I was journaling one day, and 5 or 6 people came to mind. 2 of them were men that I knew in college, so they're about my age. So that's convicting, very convicting and depressing in some ways. 2 others were pastors that I know. One pastor that I worked with for a little bit, another pastor that did some counseling for Ashley and myself and just kind of poured himself into me. And another was a former professor of mine in college. And I think I could probably list a few more, but I listed men that I had a deep personal relationship with and saw up close and personal. And yeah, they just kind of match that concept, that definition of congruence, especially for the Christian life. Um, and I compare those men to myself, and I did this thing in my journal where I wrote down, well, what were the fruits of the Spirit that they showed? What were the qualities that they had that I don't have? And I tried to look at that and try to challenge myself, like what goals I need to set. And I did that several months ago, and I've probably forgotten all that I read or that I wrote down in my journal. But this other was earlier part in the preface in Peterson's book. This is where I was really convicted. He says he begins in the pulpit. He realized he did not know how to preach. He says, I was not a preacher. I was doing from the pulpit each Sunday was not what I was doing was not preaching. In fact, it had nothing to do with preaching. I was whipping up enthusiasm. I was explaining the nature of what we had to do while arbitrarily fitting Bible texts into key places. I'm not sure exactly what his preaching style is. I mean, you can look at some of his sermons in the book, but his regular preaching style is probably not like expository preaching like many in the Reform world do, and redemptive historical preaching. But those lines really convicted me. Sometimes I'm up there Sunday mornings. I'm like, am I really preaching? Am I letting the inner life flow to the outer life? Do people sense in me congruence? If I spoke in a different language and had a translator, I'm not getting into the whole tongues interpretation debate, but just would my manner of caring about myself and just the way I spoke words, would that display the beauty of Christ? And so I'm just convicted by all that. I'm convicted. I'm grateful for the men that I've known who display congruence. But and I was kind of pouring my heart out about this a couple weeks ago to one of my best friends. We were at a bar here in Cortland and just watching some football and talking. And I was just like, my friend's name is Joe. I was like, Joe, this is how I'm convicted. I don't have congruence. He's like, what are you talking about? And I explained all this. He's like, Daniel, you don't know if the Lord's used you at moments in someone else's life where they saw that in you, even for a moment. God's working on all of us. And I'm like, yeah, I know it's true. It's our progressive sanctification. I know that. I just don't feel that right now. But that's okay. I've discovered that that's okay. It's okay that I'm a pastor, that I'm a professing Christian, and I'm a husband and father. But maybe I'm not quite like those two friends of mine from college, or that professor from college, or these two pastors I'm thinking of. That's okay. I should be thankful that the Lord put that many men who carry that congruence into my life, because maybe most people don't even know one or two of those kinds of people. But I'm glad I got to know those few men. I don't have contact with them as much now that I live in Yankee land. And that's been probably the hardest thing since moving up here. We miss our former church, and we miss nicer winters and all. Although I do love the snow up here. Snow's actually kind of nice. But I miss not being in close proximity to some of these men, because they all basically live in the South. They all live in the Carolinas. And so I miss not being in proximity to those men, but I feel the Lord is calling me to imitate those men as they are imitating Christ, because the Northeast is is very hard soil, a dark place spiritually, and so we need more Christians and pastors and churches that are showing the inner life with Christ in our outer life. And so taking as a challenge for myself as a pastor, and try not to get too depressed about it. That's my main challenge to myself. My question for you is, who are those Christians in your life that display that congruence, that seamless connection between inner life and outer life? They are living in harmony with Christ, and that's just obvious to anyone who speaks to them or knows them. And what is God telling you about their life, which can be imitated in your life? What's God saying to you about that, and what are you going to do about it? what steps will you take to grow in your sanctification, become more, not just like these people, but more Christ-like? All right, that's it. I'll probably do another YouTube video later in the week. They have a busy week. Got my mom coming in town, and then I'm going to Presbytery, a weekend Presbytery retreat with my wife. It'll be our last time going away overnight together until the baby comes. Then once the baby comes in mid-January, then we probably won't go away overnight together for like another year or two. So we're going to savor this going away overnight together. And it's Presbytery, because I love Presbytery. So two great things happening this weekend. All right, take care and God bless.